patria o muerte.
Episode 7, The Woman Who Saw the End. 1. The Illusion of Forces. History likes to pretend it is driven by forces alone. We are taught to look at the grand abstractions, economics, demographics, geography, technology. We are told that these are the tides that pull the ship of state, and that individuals are merely interchangeable captains gripping the wheel of a vessel they cannot steer. In this view, a leader is a symbol at best, an accident at worst. It is a comforting belief. It allows systems to absolve themselves. If war is inevitable because of resource scarcity, then no general is guilty. If collapse is inevitable because of debt cycles, then no banker is to blame. But it is false. Systems determine possibility. They set the board. They deal the cards. But individuals determine direction. And when systems approach collapse, when the board is shaking and the rules are dissolving, the range of viable directions narrows so violently that a single mind, positioned correctly, can bend the outcome. This is where she enters the story. She does not enter as a savior descending from the clouds. She does not enter as a revolutionary burning down the palace. She enters as something far rarer and far more dangerous. She enters as an interpreter of inevitability. 2. The education of contradiction. She was born in Brazil, a country that was already living inside the contradictions of the future long before the rest of the world caught up. Brazil is a nation that was never quite Western, yet deeply European, never quite Southern, yet undeniably exploited, never homogeneous, yet never fully broken by its differences. Brazil is not a country that teaches you ideology. It is too messy for pure ideas. It teaches you scale. It teaches you the scale of inequality, where skyscrapers cast shadows over slums. It teaches you the scale of bureaucracy, where a stamp on a document can determine a life. It teaches you the scale of adaptation, where survival depends on finding the jeitinho, the little way around the impossible obstacle. She grew up fluent in contradiction. She was black in a society that pretends race is invisible, learning early that silence is often a form of enforcement. She was Brazilian in a world that treats Brazil as peripheral, a colorful supplier of coffee and football, not ideas. She was female in institutions still built for men who confuse dominance with authority, who mistake shouting for leading. From the beginning, she learned the most important political lesson of the coming century, one that the loud populists of the North never grasped. Power does not announce itself. It organizes quietly. Her education was unremarkable only to those who misunderstand how elites are actually formed in the twilight of empire. She did not go to Harvard or Oxford. She did not have a mythic origin story involving a log cabin or a struggle against tyranny. Instead, she had accumulation. She studied law, not to argue in court, but to understand the code of the state. She studied public administration, not to push paper, but to see where the paper got stuck. She studied international relations, not to attend cocktail parties, but to map the fault lines. She studied history, not as a narrative of heroes, but as a structure of causes. She specialized in what others avoided. While her peers wrote papers on human rights or economic growth, she wrote about governance failure. Why states collapse? Why federations fracture? Why revolutions rot into oligarchies? She was not interested in ideals. Ideals were fragile. She was interested in durability. Future leaders are not trained to inspire. Inspiration is cheap, it burns out like a match. They are trained to endure complexity without hallucinating solutions. 3. The archivist of decay. Her early career placed her inside multilateral institutions, the UN, the WTO, the World Bank, at the exact moment they began losing relevance. She was a functionary in the mausoleum of the post-war order. She sat in the back of the room, taking notes, watching resolutions pass that no one intended to enforce. She saw sanctions imposed that no one feared, because the targets had already moved their money to safe havens. She watched summits convened not to solve problems, but to preserve the appearance that problems were solvable. This is where her clarity sharpened. She realized that the world was not suffering from bad intentions. The diplomats were polite. The NGOs were earnest. The politicians were worried. The world was suffering from undersized structures. Every institution she worked for assumed a level of cooperation that no longer existed. The UN assumed that the great powers wanted peace more than they wanted victory. The WTO assumed that trade would always trump security. Every agreement relied on good faith that had become strategically irrational. Every moral appeal was a confession of weakness. She did not critique this publicly. She did not write op-eds or give interviews. She archived it. She built an internal model of global decay, not as a sudden, cinematic collapse, but as a reversion. A reversion to empire. This is what separated her from the activists, the critics, and the idealists who shouted outside the gates. They were mourning the death of the post-war order. They wanted to resuscitate it. She accepted it as a phase transition. Like ice melting into water, the old world was changing state. You cannot argue with physics. And then she asked the only question that matters in such moments. What survives the transition? 4. The strategist of convergence. Her rise was not meteoric. Meteors fall. It was gravitational. She accumulated mass until she could not be ignored. She became indispensable in the darkest corners of diplomacy, the negotiations no one wanted to claim responsibility for because failure was guaranteed. Failed states in the Sahel. Post-conflict administrations in the Levant. Trade disputes involving incompatible legal systems in the South China Sea. She was calm where others moralized. She was precise where others improvised. She was unsentimental where others performed outrage. Presidents noticed. Not because she was loyal only to the outcome, but because she was right. Under one particularly influential president, a man himself aware that the world he governed was slipping beyond repair, she was elevated. Not publicly. There was no press conference. Not ceremonially. There was no ribbon cutting. Strategically. She was placed at the intersection of Europe, Africa, and Latin America. She was given a portfolio that didn't have a clear name, but had a clear mandate: manage the drift. She sat exactly where the fault lines converged. And this was not coincidence. It was recognition. Diplomacy in the 21st century is no longer about persuasion. It is not about convincing the other side that you are right. It is about alignment under threat. Her first move was not to propose unity. That would have been premature. It was to diagnose extinction paths. In confidential briefings, delivered in soundproof rooms to ashen-faced ministers, she laid out futures not as predictions, but as inevitabilities conditional on inaction. Scenario A: Africa fragments into extraction zones governed by external capital, China, and internal militias. The state ceases to exist, the continent becomes a mine. Scenario B: Latin America is absorbed hemispherically. Economically first, then politically. Sovereignty becomes a local fiction under a northern umbrella. Scenario C: Southern Europe is reduced to managed decline. Culturally intact, perhaps, but strategically irrelevant, a nursing home for the North. She did not present these as tragedies. She didn't use sad adjectives. She presented them as default outcomes. This is what happens if you do nothing. And then she did something unexpected. She demonstrated that all three outcomes shared the same underlying cause. It wasn't poverty. It wasn't corruption. It wasn't bad leadership. It was insufficient scale. No military alliance could fix it, the armies were too small. No trade deal could fix it, the markets were too fragmented. No cultural revival could fix it, nostalgia is not a shield. Only structural unification could. 5. The engineering of survival. This is where her thinking became dangerous. Because she did not argue for unity as resistance, the old anti-colonial reflex of uniting against the oppressor. She argued for unity as compliance with reality. The world, she told them, no longer rewards fragmentation. It punishes it. And punishment is blind. It doesn't care if you are a proud ancient nation. It just crushes you. Global politics had reached a point where survival itself had become ideological. States that refused to adapt framed their collapse as dignity. She refused that framing. Dignity without continuity, she wrote in the margins of a draft, is vanity. Her proposal was not yet a proposal. It was a thought experiment whispered in the corridors of power. What if Europe, Africa, and Latin America stopped behaving as the endpoints of other people's empires, and instead recognized themselves as a single Atlantic system? What if oceans were treated as connectors again, as they were in the age of sail? What if shared languages, Portuguese, Spanish, French, were leveraged as code rather than marginalized as culture? What if the nation-state was demoted, not abolished, but subordinated to something larger. And the most terrifying question of all. What if democracy itself were redesigned to operate at civilizational scale? These questions terrified everyone who heard them. Because they did not sound like ideology. They didn't sound like a manifesto. They sounded like engineering. Black women in power are often tolerated as symbols. They are put on posters to show diversity. She was not symbolic. She was procedural. She did not demand visibility. She demanded interoperability. She understood something that eluded most of her contemporaries, that the coming century would not be decided by who wins elections. Elections were increasingly noisy and irrelevant. It would be decided by who can coordinate millions of decisions without collapse. This is why she focused obsessively on digital governance. Not social media, which she viewed as a solvent of society. Not propaganda. But verifiable, direct, scalable participation. Representative democracy, she argued in a restricted memo, was designed for populations orders of magnitude smaller, slower, and less interconnected. It relies on the delay of the horse and the steamship. It was not corrupt. It was obsolete. And obsolescence, in imperial eras, is fatal. Her critics accused her of technocracy. They called her cold, unfeeling. They were correct. She did not deny it. She simply asked what alternative could survive. Faith-based unity? Impossible, too many gods. Ethnic unity? Explosive, too many tribes. National unity? Insufficient, too small. Only procedural unity scaled. Only rules without myth endured. 6. The secular firewall. This is where the most controversial aspect of her thinking emerged, not as a provocation, but as a logical conclusion. Religion could not coexist with planetary governance. Not because belief is false. She didn't care about truth in the metaphysical sense. But because belief is non-negotiable. A system that must adapt continuously, that must update its laws like software, cannot tolerate axioms that are immune to revision. You cannot negotiate with the divine. So she drew a line that no leader before her had drawn so cleanly. Faith is private. Law is secular. Education is non-metaphysical. Not as repression. She didn't want to burn churches. But as a firewall. Secular state was no longer a philosophical preference, a legacy of the Enlightenment. It was a survival constraint. She understood the backlash this would provoke. She expected the riots, the sermons, the outrage. She modeled it. Short-term unrest, high. Medium-term resistance, moderate. Long-term stabilization, optimal. Every simulation showed the same curve. Pain now, or annihilation later. This is why she never framed her vision as utopia. She never promised happiness. She framed it as minimum viable civilization. 7. The inevitable. The moment she stopped being ignored was the moment intelligence agencies in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow began flagging her briefings as anomalous. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too consistent. Across continents, across cultures, across economic datasets, her conclusions converged on the same point. This frightened the empires. Because empires thrive on chaos at the margins. They like a messy world where they can play divide and conquer. Her vision eliminated margins. By the end of this chapter, she has not yet made a public speech. She has not stood on a balcony. She has not announced a movement. She has not named the Ultramarine Project. But something irreversible has happened. A sufficient number of people, powerful people, quiet people, people who keep the lights on and the water running, now understand the same thing she does. That the end is visible. That the old powers cannot stop it. And that the only question left is whether humanity reorganizes before the collapse, or as a result of it. She saw the end. And because she saw it clearly, unflinchingly, without the comfort of hope or the luxury of despair, she also saw the only path beyond it. And she began to walk it.